The morning sun had barely crested over the Nevada desert when Colonel Zhang Wei stepped off the military transport aircraft, his boots hitting American soil with a confidence that matched the crisp salute he received from the U.S. liaison officer. Behind him, 30 of China's most elite special operations soldiers filed out in perfect formation, the cream of the People's Liberation Army Special Operations Forces, hand-picked for this unprecedented exchange program. "Welcome to the National Training Center," said Lieutenant Colonel Mike Davidson, extending his hand. "We're honored to host you for this joint training exercise." Zhang Wei shook it firmly, his translator quickly relaying his response. "The honor is ours. We are eager to learn from America's experience and demonstrate the capabilities of Chinese special forces." What neither man knew was that this would become one of the most humbling experiences in modern military exchange history. A cautionary tale that would be whispered about in defense circles for years to come, despite both nations' efforts to keep the details classified. The setup, the joint exercise, had been months in planning, a diplomatic gesture during a brief thaw in U.S.-China relations. The concept was simple. Chinese special forces would participate in a standard rotation of U.S. military combat readiness drills, the same exercises that American units ran regularly to maintain operational effectiveness. These weren't elite SEAL Team 6 operations or Delta Force missions. These were the bread-and-butter training exercises that formed the backbone of American military preparedness. The Chinese contingent had arrived with impressive credentials. Each soldier had years of experience, multiple commendations, and had survived brutally competitive selection processes. They were physically fit, mentally sharp, and intensely motivated. The Chinese military had spent considerable resources preparing them for this moment, viewing it as an opportunity to showcase their modernization efforts and prove they could match American capabilities stride for stride. "We've designed a comprehensive 2-week program," Davidson explained as they walked toward the briefing room. "Today we'll start with basic squad-level infantry tactics, then progress through vehicle operations, close-quarters combat, long-range reconnaissance, and integrated combined arms exercises." Zhang Wei nodded, noting how the American colonel emphasized basic exercises. He interpreted it as either humility or perhaps a subtle underestimation of Chinese capabilities. His team had trained for months specifically for this exchange. They would show these Americans what the new Chinese military could do. Hour 1, the awakening. The first exercise seemed straightforward enough. A basic patrol formation drill across hostile terrain with simulated enemy contact. It was the kind of exercise that Davidson's unit could execute in their sleep, a routine scenario they'd run hundreds of times with variations. "Standard spread formation," Davidson instructed. 2 fire teams, staggered column. Watch for IED indicators, maintain 360-degree security, communicate constantly. Enemy contact expected from multiple vectors. This is a live-fire exercise with simulation rounds. The Chinese team moved out with military precision, their formation textbook perfect. For the first 10 minutes, they looked sharp. Then, everything began to unravel. The first problem emerged with communications. While the Chinese soldiers had been briefed in English and had translators, the rapid-fire combat communication protocols used by American forces proved overwhelming. American soldiers communicate constantly during operations, brief, coded, efficient bursts of information that create a shared battlefield awareness. The Chinese team trained in a more hierarchical system where information flowed up and down the chain of command rather than laterally, struggled to adapt. "Contact right, 50 meters, behind the berm," shouted one American observer, simulating enemy fire. The Chinese formation froze for a critical 3 seconds, not long in normal time, but an eternity in combat, as the information was processed, translated, and acted upon. In a real firefight, half the squad would have been casualties, but the communication issues were just the beginning. As the exercise progressed, more fundamental problems emerged. The Chinese soldiers had been trained to operate with rigid adherence to predetermined plans. When the American observers threw in unexpected complications, a simulated vehicle breakdown, a change in enemy positions, a civilian obstacle, the Chinese team struggled to adapt. "They're waiting for orders," observed Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, one of the exercise evaluators. "Look at them. Every time something changes, they freeze and look at their team leader." It was true. While American soldiers are trained to exercise initiative and make decisions at the lowest level, what the military calls decentralized command, the Chinese soldiers had been trained in a system that emphasized obedience and following orders. The result was a force that looked impressive when executing a predetermined plan, but became dangerously slow and rigid when circumstances changed. By the end of the first hour, the exercise had to be paused 3 times for safety violations. In one instance, Chinese soldiers had inadvertently flagged each other with weapons, a basic safety failure that would have ended military careers in the American system. In another, they'd failed to identify a simulated friendly patrol, nearly engaging them as enemies. Hour 2. The collapse. If the first hour had been concerning, the second hour revealed the full scope of the gap between the two forces. The exercise progressed to a hostage rescue scenario, a relatively straightforward drill involving clearing a building, neutralizing hostiles, and extracting friendly personnel. It was the kind of operation that American Special Forces units train for relentlessly, but it was also a standard capability expected of any competent infantry unit. The Chinese team approached the scenario with impressive aggression and physical courage. They moved fast, they were willing to expose themselves to simulated fire, and they attacked the objective with determination. But aggression without competence is just chaos. The fundamental issue was that the Chinese soldiers had been trained primarily through rote memorization and repetitive drills of specific scenarios. They'd practiced building clearing, but they'd practiced specific building layouts with predetermined enemy positions. When confronted with a building they hadn't trained in, with enemies in positions they hadn't memorized, they reverted to confusion. "They're using the wrong breaching technique for that door type," noted Master Sergeant James Cooper, a veteran of multiple combat deployments. "That's a reinforced metal frame, you can't kick that in. They should be using the Halligan tool or going through the wall." But the Chinese team didn't adapt. They'd been trained to breach doors a specific way. And that's what they did, repeatedly, unsuccessfully, burning precious seconds while taking simulated casualties. Inside the building, things got worse. The principle of violence of action, the controlled aggression that allows special operations forces to dominate a situation, requires both aggression and control. The Chinese team had the first part but struggled with the second. "Check your backstop," an American observer shouted, as one Chinese soldier fired simulated rounds without properly identifying what was behind his target. In this case, it was a simulated hostage, a mission failure. The exercise was called off after 40 minutes when it became clear that the Chinese team had essentially failed every major objective. Hostages were killed by friendly fire. Team members were injured by improper movement techniques, and the simulated enemies had been allowed to escape and regroup multiple times. The reckoning, the after-action review, was conducted with diplomatic care, but there was no hiding the reality. The American observers had documented every mistake, every hesitation, every failure of judgment or technique. It wasn't that the Chinese soldiers were cowardly or lazy, they were brave and had worked hard. But their training system had fundamentally failed to prepare them for the fluid, adaptive, chaotic reality of modern combat operations. Colonel Zhang Wei sat stone-faced through the review, his translator quietly relaying the litany of issues. But he was a professional soldier, and he couldn't deny what he'd witnessed. "The problem," Davidson said carefully, trying to be diplomatic, "is not a lack of courage or physical capability. Your soldiers are clearly dedicated and fit. The issue is the decision-making architecture. Modern combat, especially special operations, requires every soldier to be able to think independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and make life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second." Zhang Wei nodded slowly. He'd seen it himself. His men were trained to follow orders, to execute plans, to maintain discipline. These were valuable military virtues, to be sure. But the Americans had something his force lacked: the ability to operate effectively in chaos, to maintain coherence when plans fell apart, to trust individual soldiers to make the right call without waiting for permission. It was a product of two fundamentally different military cultures. The American military, for all its flaws, had spent decades learning painful lessons from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They'd learned that modern warfare, especially counterinsurgency and special operations, required adaptable, thinking soldiers who could operate independently. The Chinese military, by contrast, was still built around the principle of centralized control and obedience to authority. "There's something else," added Sergeant Rodriguez, consulting her notes. "Physical fitness standards. I don't mean to be insulting, but several of your soldiers struggled with the load-bearing march. American soldiers routinely carry 70 to 100 pounds of gear over rough terrain. That's our baseline expectation." It was another uncomfortable truth. While the Chinese soldiers looked fit and performed well in standard physical training tests, they hadn't been conditioned for the reality of modern combat operations where soldiers might need to move for hours, carrying massive loads of ammunition, water, medical supplies, and equipment. The bet that wasn't in the years since. A story has circulated in certain military circles about a Chinese official betting $20,000 that his special forces could match American performance in these drills. Like many military legends, the truth is more complicated. There was no official bet. Such gambling would have been inappropriate for a formal military exchange. But there was definitely a sense of Chinese confidence bordering on arrogance before the exercise, and there's no question that money changed hands informally among observers who'd wagered on the outcome. What's certain is that the Chinese delegation cut their planned 2-week training rotation short, departing after just 3 days. The official explanation was a scheduling conflict requiring their immediate return to China. The unofficial reality, according to multiple sources familiar with the exchange, was that Colonel Zhang Wei had recommended ending the program early to avoid further embarrassment. They weren't learning anything useful at that point, one American officer explained years later. Speaking on condition of anonymity, they were just being repeatedly shown what they couldn't do. There's no value in that. Zhang Wei was a professional. He saw that continuing would just demoralize his men without producing useful training outcomes. The deeper issues, the failure of the Chinese special forces in these exercises, illuminated several critical weaknesses in the PLA's modernization program. Training philosophy. The Chinese military remained wedded to a training system that emphasized rote memorization and adherence to doctrine. While this could produce technically proficient soldiers in controlled conditions, it failed to develop the adaptability required for modern warfare. Command culture, the hierarchical, obedience-focused culture of the PLA, actively discouraged the kind of initiative-taking that American forces depend on. Chinese soldiers were trained to wait for orders, not to make decisions. In modern combat, this is often fatal. Combat experience. Perhaps most critically, the PLA had not fought a significant military engagement since 1979. For all the criticism American military adventures receive, they've provided American forces with decades of hard-earned combat experience. American trainers are often combat veterans who've learned lessons under fire. Chinese trainers were operating from theory and historical study, equipment familiarity. While China has modernized its military equipment significantly, the Chinese soldiers showed limited familiarity with proper use of their gear under stress. American soldiers live with their equipment, train with it constantly, and know instinctively how to employ every tool they carry. The Chinese soldiers knew their equipment in theory, but struggled with practical application under pressure. Physical conditioning. Modern combat operations are brutally physically demanding. American forces have learned this through painful experience in Afghanistan's mountains and Iraq's cities. Chinese forces, trained largely in controlled conditions, hadn't fully internalized what combat fitness actually requires. The American perspective for the American trainers, the exercise was eye-opening in its own way. Many had bought into the narrative of a rapidly modernizing Chinese military that was approaching parity with American capabilities. What they witnessed suggested that while China had invested heavily in equipment and technology, they were still decades behind in the human factors that actually determine combat effectiveness. Equipment is easy, Sergeant Cooper explained later. You can buy advanced weapons, vehicles, communications gear. What you can't buy is the culture, the experience, the institutional knowledge that makes soldiers effective. That takes decades to build, and it requires a willingness to learn from failures and adapt. I'm not sure the Chinese system allows for that kind of evolution. But the Americans also came away with a healthy respect for Chinese determination. They didn't quit, noted Lieutenant Colonel Davidson. They kept trying, even when it was clear they were struggling. That counts for something. Give them 20 years of real focus on these problems, and they could be formidable. The aftermath in the years since this exchange, both nations have been careful to control the narrative. Official reports describe the exercise as a valuable learning experience and a successful military-to-military engagement. The details of what actually happened have been carefully classified by both sides, though stories have leaked through various channels. For China, the experience reportedly triggered some soul-searching within the PLA. Reform-minded officers used it as evidence that China's military modernization needed to focus on more than just equipment. Training methods, command philosophy, and combat readiness all needed fundamental reform. How much progress has been made remains classified, but Western observers note that Chinese military exercises have become more realistic and demanding in recent years. For the United States, the exercise served as a useful reminder not to overestimate potential adversaries. While China represents a significant strategic challenge, particularly in areas like cyber warfare and SAL technology, the human element of military power still matters. Technology can be bought or stolen. Combat effectiveness has to be earned. The broader lesson, the story of the Chinese Special Forces' struggle with American training drills, is more than just a tale of military one-upmanship. It's a case study in how organizational culture, training philosophy, and combat experience create capabilities that can't be quickly replicated. Military power isn't just about the number of troops or the sophistication of weapons. It's about whether those troops can think, adapt, and execute effectively under the incredible stress and chaos of combat. It's about whether your training system produces soldiers who can handle the unexpected, make good decisions under pressure, and work effectively as teams without constant supervision. These are capabilities that take decades to develop. They require a willingness to fail, learn, and adapt. They require a culture that values initiative and independent thinking, even when that sometimes leads to mistakes. They require real combat experience that can only be earned through actual operations. The Chinese Special Forces who participated in this exercise weren't failures as soldiers. They were professionals who had worked hard and achieved the standards set by their system. The problem was that their system had set the wrong standards, prepared them for the wrong kind of warfare, and given them the wrong kind of training. For military planners on both sides, the exercise provided valuable intelligence. For the Chinese, it illuminated gaps that needed to be addressed. For the Americans, it provided a realistic assessment of a potential adversary's actual capabilities versus their theoretical ones. Conclusion. The story ends not with humiliation, but with a measure of mutual respect. Colonel Zhang Wei reportedly wrote a detailed report for his superiors, candidly assessing his unit's performance and recommending significant changes to Chinese Special Forces training. The American trainers praised the Chinese soldiers' courage and determination, even while noting their tactical shortcomings. In the years since, both militaries have continued to evolve. China has invested heavily in more realistic training, and some reports suggest significant improvements. American forces have continued to refine their capabilities based on ongoing operational experience. But the fundamental lesson remains: military effectiveness is built on more than equipment and manpower. It's built on culture, experience, training philosophy, and the willingness to learn from failure. These are assets that can't be quickly acquired, no matter how much money you spend or how impressive your military parades look. The 2-hour debacle in the Nevada desert wasn't really about Chinese failure or American superiority. It was about the harsh reality that building a truly effective military force is one of the hardest tasks any nation can undertake, and there are no shortcuts to success.